It was a disease that cut down the beef industry in its prime. Farmers were ruined, and over 100 young people have died slow deaths. But what could have caused BSE? One scientist has an astonishing new theory that animal feed was contaminated by infected human corpses imported from Asia.
There was a risk of a human-infected cadaver entering the animal feed. We believe this was the method, that the route that actually started BSE in the first place. Ensuring that there's no possibility of infected remains entering human food and then transmitting to humans is of paramount concern throughout the world.
Animal feed is at the heart of the BSE story. Critically, the disease became an epidemic because we turned naturally vegetarian cows into cannibals. But what of its origin? Scientists believe it could have been caused by cows being fed sheep remains infected with the related disease scrapie, or remains including a rare mutation in cattle themselves. But neither theory's been proved beyond doubt. Animal feed has always been the prime suspect in spreading BSE between cattle, because sick animals were ground up and fed back to cows, creating the BSE epidemic. But with no clear answer as to how the BSE infection got into the feed in the first place, one man has made it his mission to try to find out.
The inferior frontal lobe is also going around into the insular cortex. And it does.
Consultant neurosurgeon Alan Colchester treated some of the earliest victims of variant CJD. Naturally occurring forms of the disease have been known about for decades. This new and unique form was linked to the outbreak of BSE in cattle. But just who had infected who?
It's absolutely vital to understand as far as possible what are the key causal events in this whole chain. And so the possibility of infected imports has been considered, but no one has really looked at quantitatively where the main sources came from, nor, in our view, considered comprehensively the range of possible contaminants. Because if you look at the Indian subcontinent, the biggest source of our imports, and you look at the potential sources of infection, it then becomes quite obvious that a human has to be a prime candidate.
In the 1960s, Britain was pioneering the use of animal feed rich in protein to boost milk yields. Professor Colchester calculates that this is the time period when the original infection behind BSE is most likely to have happened.
This is the main control panel, where just by doing this, I've laid on dinner for 500 animals.
By the 1970s, industrial feeding was big business. Few questioned the contents. In fact, feed compounders were using the carcasses of old and sick animals deemed unfit for human consumption, ground up and boiled down to make meat and bone meal. Perhaps people didn't want to know what went into animal feed, but even if they did, manufacturers regarded the recipe as a trade secret. Back in 1970, when the trade in animal byproducts was at its height, Mike Copland was a researcher at the Y Agricultural College in Kent. Colin Whitaker, the local vet, was the first to recognise BSE as a new disease. To your mind, what did you know about what was in animal feed, thinking back to the late 60s?
In the early days when I came into practice in the late 60s, I didn't know what was in an animal feed like this. It was a secret with the compounders, and a closely guarded secret between different compounders because they were in opposition to each other.
So almost there was a commercial benefit to having a higher protein content, perhaps. And what was your understanding?
Well, I mean, I agree that was the picture, and I mean, one wonders whether it was also because some of the food was coming from an origin that maybe it shouldn't have, that helped to reinforce that need to keep quiet about exactly what was in it.
The Indian subcontinent was the chief source of imports to the UK, where Colchester claims that the gathering of bones and animal carcasses from the rivers is an important local trade. But in a land where Hindus believe that their remains must be returned to the Ganges after death, the peasants also encounter large numbers of human corpses. The defilement of the Ganges has been documented by an American anthropologist.
I used that particular photo because it has the Ganga as a backdrop, and then on a sandbar between the Ganga and another sort of effluent stream that's really entering the river, there's a very large pile of bones. Now, I can't tell you if they're human or animal bones, but it's clear that somebody has collected them. People told me when I asked about this particular picture that I had that some locals are collecting the bones and crushing them and selling them as fertilizer.
Some bones and carcasses are also sold abroad. Colchester has unearthed documents indicating long-standing concerns about the implications of the trade, specifically the fear that untreated material might bring in anthrax. An investigation by French dock authorities was prompted when one docker died after handling unsterilised bones being imported from Asia in the mid-1960s to make glue, gelatin for human food and for animal feed.
The bones, reduced to small pieces, did not allow a differentiation between animal and human, but on opening the sacks they found the bodies of crabs, all sorts of rubbish, a comb and a complete head of hair of a woman.
Colchester estimates that each year around 120 Hindus die from some form of CJD. His experience as a neurologist led him towards the conclusion that if their bodies were committed to the Ganges, this could have been the source of the BSE epidemic.
We know that during the time period when BSE must have first occurred in the UK, that there was extensive collection of animal byproducts, but including some human remains, in the eastern Indian subcontinent that went into exports that came to the UK. And we know that those materials were used in animal feed manufacture in the UK over a long period. And some manufacturers deliberately looked for favoured sources that would have high protein or particular properties. And during that period, there must have been a number of years when there was exposure to the risk of a human-infected cadaver entering the animal feed.
So do the specialists who've worked on these so-called prion diseases most closely accept Colchester's theory about the origins of BSE?
This is a plausible hypothesis. I think it is worthy of further investigation, particularly the first part of the hypothesis, which concerns the importation of this material into the UK. If that is confirmed, then further thought may well need to be given to what additional measures should be performed in order to confirm the link, as it were, between this material and BSE.
Patients with all different forms of prion disease have not produced any evidence of finding that it's the same as BSE. We can differentiate them all from BSE. So our experience is that there's nothing really out there in the human population in patients developing prion diseases that looks like BSE.
Today, the Environment Department told Newsnight it knew about bone imports from India and the practice of collecting carcasses, including human remains, from the river Ganges, but denied that the material was used in animal feed in the period when cattle were likely to have first been infected. Colchester said the government has looked at the wrong time period and ignored the possibility that animal feed could also have been contaminated with bones destined for fertiliser. Finding out where BSE came from is more than an academic exercise. BSE devastated British farming, destroyed the public's faith in scientists and politicians, and has already killed more than 100 young people. Without knowing how it all started, we can never be sure we won't see its likes again. British cows and bulls are all supposed to be vegetarian now, since the ban in the late 1990s on feeding cows to cows. But unexplained cases of BSE are still cropping up elsewhere in Europe, with the risk that implies for people too. Colchester's not claiming his new theories proven, but sufficiently compelling to demand further investigation.